I've called East Tennessee home for most of my life, a place where mountains rise like ancient sentinels, cradling sprawling forests and shadowy hollows that feel untouched by time. Growing up, I heard the same stories that every kid in this region does, dark tales of creatures lurking in the wilderness. They were always framed as harmless warnings to keep kids from wandering too far, to keep us safe from steep ravines and the cold indifference of nature. But as I listened to my grandmother's whispered tales of shadowy figures and blood-curdling screams carried on the wind, there was always a part of me that wondered if there was more to these stories than just cautionary folklore. Of course, as a child, I still pulled the covers tight over my head when the wind rattled my bedroom window, a window that happened to face the woods, the wild, endless woods. As I grew older, I came to love those tales of the strange and unexplained, no longer finding them terrifying, but instead intriguing. I became fascinated with cryptids, those strange creatures spoken of in hushed tones. Bigfoot, the Mothman, and the lesser-known but far more terrifying Dogman. Most people around here were fixated on Bigfoot, as if he were some kind of local celebrity. But for me, the Dogman always held a darker, more menacing allure. Maybe it was because fewer people spoke of it, or because the descriptions of it in local lore were so much more grotesque. Whatever the reason, I never imagined I'd one day find myself face to face with a monster like that. Back then, I was just another kid with a fascination for the unknown, a fascination that would eventually shape my life's path. After high school, I became a park ranger, a job that seemed perfect for me, a blend of my love for nature and my growing curiosity about the strange stories that swirled around these mountains. It was a job that promised peace and purpose, but as I would learn, the Smoky Mountains are anything but peaceful. Looking back, I think it was my fascination with those old tales that made me blind to the danger. For years, I'd heard whispers of hikers disappearing, of campers finding their sites destroyed with no sign of what had done it. Most of my co-workers laughed these things off, blaming bears or the unpredictable whims of the wilderness. But I always wondered if there was something more to it. It wasn't until October of that year that I found out the truth. It was the kind of October day that makes you fall in love with autumn all over again. The forest was a tapestry of reds, oranges, and yellows, the air crisp and carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves. I was on my usual patrol, hiking up to Clingman's Dome, my favorite spot to sit and watch the world from above. From there, you could see a sea of treetops stretching to the horizon, an endless wave of color that always reminded me why I chose this life. But that day, my moment of peace was interrupted by a call on the radio. A woman reported her husband, son, and brother-in-law missing. They had gone out fishing near Fontana Lake and never returned. My stomach sank at the thought of what might have happened to them, though I told myself it was probably something harmless. Maybe they'd just lost track of time or had some car trouble. Still, there was an urgency in the woman's voice that I couldn't shake. She gave me their descriptions. A man in his 40s, a boy of about 14, and another man in his 30s. She described their truck and the small fishing boat they'd taken. I told her I'd head out immediately, and with that, I began my journey into the unknown. Fontana Lake was a fair drive from where I'd been stationed, tucked deep in the rugged terrain where North Carolina bleeds into Tennessee. The trip down was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling in my gut, like the forest itself was trying to tell me something was wrong. The air grew heavier as I drove, the sunlight dimming behind a thick wall of clouds that had rolled in from the mountains. By the time I reached the lake, the day had taken on a muted, almost sepia tone, as if the world were holding its breath. I parked my truck near the water's edge and scanned the area, looking for any sign of the missing party. That was when I spotted the 3 trucks. 2 had empty boat trailers hitched to their backs, their tires half buried in the muddy bank. One of the trucks matched the description the woman had given me, and my heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was where they had started their trip. I walked down to the water's edge and looked both ways, hoping to catch sight of them returning from a long day of fishing. But the lake was empty, its surface eerily still. Nearby, a small house stood nestled among the trees, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. I decided to check with the owner to see if they had seen or heard anything. The man who answered the door was friendly at first, offering a warm smile and a firm handshake. But when I mentioned Wolf Creek, his demeanor changed. His smile faded, replaced by a look of unease, and he shifted his weight as if he wanted to end the conversation. "Yeah, I saw them," he said, his voice quieter now. 2 men and a boy. They were heading west toward Wolf Creek. When I asked if he could ferry me across the lake to save time, his response was almost a whisper. "I'll take you across the river, but I ain't going near Wolf Creek." Something about the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't push him for an explanation. His eyes told me enough. Whatever it was about Wolf Creek, he wanted no part of it. After grabbing my backpack from the truck, I boarded his small motorboat and let him take me across the water. He didn't say a word during the trip, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When we reached the other side, he barely gave me time to thank him before he turned the boat around and sped off, leaving me alone on the rocky shore. From there, it was a mile-long hike to the campsite I suspected the family had used. The forest was dense, the trees pressing in around me as if trying to push me back. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn ground and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It didn't take long to find their boat, tied to a tree near the water's edge. Everything about it looked normal, no signs of damage, no blood, nothing out of place. But as I made my way up the hill toward the campsite, that uneasy feeling returned, stronger than ever. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The campsite was in ruins. 2 tents were set up, but both had been torn open, their contents scattered across the ground. Sleeping bags lay in crumpled heaps, and a campfire pit sat cold and untouched. My eyes fell on a splash of red near the second tent, and my heart sank. Blood. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to confirm that something bad had happened here. As I stood there trying to make sense of the scene, I noticed something lying near the second tent, a notebook. It was a cheap spiral-bound journal, the kind a kid might use for school, and its cover was smudged with dirt. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the neat handwriting. It belonged to the boy. The entries were dated, the handwriting growing more hurried and shaky as they progressed. I read the first entry aloud to myself, my voice echoing in the empty clearing. October 3rd. We headed out for our annual fishing trip this morning. Mom wasn't too happy, but we told her we'd be back tomorrow. The drive to the boat launch was kind of long, but we filled the time talking about all the fish we were going to catch. Eventually, Dad started telling stories about the area, trying to scare me with tales of a cryptid that lived nearby. I knew he was just pulling my leg, trying to get a rise out of me. Uncle Roger laughed at his attempts, saying, "You can't scare the boy anymore, John. He's too old for ghost stories." I wanted to believe Uncle Roger was right. I told myself I was too old to be scared by campfire tales. But looking back, maybe I should have listened to those stories a little more carefully. When we reached the boat launch, the mood was light-hearted. We loaded the boat without much trouble, though Uncle Roger nearly fell in, and we had a good laugh at his expense and headed out into the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and yellow hues of the trees along the shore. It was perfect fishing weather. Dad said he'd heard about a good spot up by Wolf Creek, so we decided to head there. By the time we arrived, it was getting late, and the air had grown cooler. Uncle Roger caught 3 largemouth bass in no time, and even I managed to reel in a couple. Dad had a big one on the line, but it got away just before we could net it. We decided to call it a day and find a campsite before dark. We found a spot not far from the creek, a little clearing surrounded by trees. It was strange. There wasn't a single soul around, even though Dad said this site was usually packed during fishing season. We set up our tents and started a fire while Uncle Roger cleaned the fish. Dinner was great. We laughed and told stories late into the night, but when we turned in, the atmosphere shifted. It's hard to explain, but something felt wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was Dad playing a prank. He'd done it before, sneaking around the campsite and making noises to try and scare me. But this time, the sounds were different. Heavy footsteps, snorting, something pawing at the ground. I stayed in my sleeping bag, too scared to move. I told myself it was just Dad, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there didn't feel human. I listened to it stomp around the campsite for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. When the noises finally stopped, I managed to drift off to sleep, telling myself it was just a dream. But when I woke up the next morning, the campsite was a mess. The tents were torn open, our gear was scattered everywhere, and Dad was gone. Uncle Roger looked just as confused and scared as I felt. He kept saying, "He's probably just playing another one of his jokes. He'll show up any minute now, laughing his head off." but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe his own words. We searched the campsite for any sign of him, but all we found were footprints leading into the woods. There was no way we were splitting up, so Uncle Roger told me to stay close as we followed the tracks. We walked for hours, calling out for Dad, but there was no response. The deeper we went into the forest, the more I felt like we were being watched. Every now and then, Uncle Roger would stop and look over his shoulder, his hand tightening around the hunting knife he'd brought along. I asked him if he thought it might be a bear, but he just shook his head and said, "I don't know, kid. I just don't know." When the sun started to set, we decided to head back to the campsite and regroup. We'd barely gotten back when we heard it again. The heavy footsteps, the snorting, the sound of something big moving through the trees. This time we saw it. It stepped into the clearing, standing on its hind legs like a man but covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed red in the firelight, and its mouth was full of teeth that seemed too big for its face. It let out a low growl, a sound that shook me to my core. I froze, unable to move, but Uncle Roger grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the tent. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice trembling. The thing sniffed the air, its head turning toward us. I prayed it wouldn't see us, but it let out a deafening roar and started toward the tent. Uncle Roger didn't hesitate. He grabbed me and we ran, slipping down the creek bank and into the water. The thing followed us, crashing through the brush like a freight train. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's a bridge downstream," Uncle Roger said. "If we can make it there and hide, maybe it'll lose our scent." We waded through the creek, the cold water soaking through our clothes and chilling us to the bone. The sound of the monster crashing through the woods grew fainter, and for a moment I thought we'd lost it. But then we heard it again, closer this time. We reached the bridge and wedged ourselves into the shadows, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. My teeth were chattering and I bit my tongue to keep from making noise. The thing stepped onto the bridge, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I could hear it sniffing the air, trying to pick up our scent. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. It stopped right above us, its massive claws scraping against the wooden boards. I thought for sure it would find us, but then it turned and walked off into the woods. Uncle Roger waited a few minutes before motioning for me to follow him. We crept out from under the bridge and made our way back to the campsite, hoping that Dad would be there waiting for us. He wasn't. I closed the notebook and let out a shaky breath. The boy's account had my pulse racing, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see glowing red eyes staring back at me. The description of the creature matched the stories I'd heard about Dogman, a beast, standing on two legs, part wolf, part man, and all nightmare. If this thing was real, then the boy and his uncle were lucky to have escaped alive. But where were they now? And what had happened to the father? I decided to follow the tracks leading away from the campsite. The boy's journal mentioned that they had gone back to the creek, so I made my way down to the water's edge. Sure enough, I found their footprints in the mud, along with the deeper, heavier tracks of the creature. The tracks led downstream to the bridge, just as the boy had described. It was eerie, standing in the same spot where they had hidden, knowing the monster had been right above them. From there, the tracks doubled back to the campsite, as if the creature had been circling them, stalking them. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they eventually disappeared into the underbrush. Frustrated, I decided to search the area around the campsite more thoroughly. That's when I found the father's tracks. They led away from his tent and stopped near the edge of the woods. There was a dark stain on the bark of a tree, and when I looked closer, I saw flecks of blood. My stomach churned as I realized what this meant. He hadn't just wandered off. He'd been taken. I felt the weight of dread settle over me as I pieced together the grim reality. The father hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been dragged away by something powerful, something far more dangerous than any ordinary predator. I followed the creature's tracks deeper into the forest, the blood spattering along its path, acting as a grim breadcrumb trail. The sun was slipping lower in the sky, casting the woods in hues of deep amber and shadowy black. My radio crackled when I tried to call for backup, but it was no use, just static. It wasn't uncommon to lose signal out here in the wilderness, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The trail led me to the base of a steep hill. At first, I thought I'd lost it, but then I noticed a faint disturbance in the dirt leading up the incline. Something or someone had been dragged this way. My eyes scanned the slope, and that's when I saw it. A cave mouth, dark and gaping, halfway up the hill. I hesitated. the logical part of my brain screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. If there was even the slightest chance that the father was still alive, I had to try. The climb was treacherous. The rain that had started earlier in the day had turned the dirt slick, and more than once I nearly lost my footing. By the time I reached the cave, I was soaked to the bone and caked in mud. The air around the entrance was thick and damp, carrying the faint stench of rot. I set my pack down just inside the mouth of the cave and pulled out my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I stepped into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing jagged walls and a rough, uneven floor. The stench grew stronger the deeper I went, a mix of wet fur, decaying meat, and something acrid that made my nose burn. I kept my hand near my holster, the weight of the sidearm a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. Each step echoed faintly, amplifying the tension that was already coiling tight in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to keep moving. The cave narrowed as I ventured further, the ceiling dropping low enough that I had to crouch. Then I saw it. A smear of blood on the wall, fresh and bright against the grey stone. My stomach twisted as I realized I was close. Too close. The narrow passage opened into a larger chamber, and my flashlight revealed the horror within. Bones littered the floor, picked clean and scattered haphazardly. Some were animal, but others were human. I froze, my breath hitching as I spotted a body slumped against the far wall. It was the father, or what was left of him. His torso was intact, but his legs were gone, reduced to gnawed stumps. His face was locked in a frozen scream, his eyes wide with terror. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. This man had been dragged from his campsite, ripped apart, and left here like a macabre trophy. My mind raced with questions. Was he alive when they tore him apart? Did he see it coming? And then, the most pressing question of all, was the creature still here? I crouched low, scanning the chamber with my flashlight. My hand hovered over my gun, ready to draw at the slightest hint of movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint drip of water from the cave ceiling. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was close, too close. The growl reverberated through the chamber, growing louder, deeper, until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. I turned, my flashlight sweeping frantically across the rocky expanse, and that's when I saw it. The creature was enormous, its hulking frame illuminated in the harsh beam of my light. It stood on two legs, its body a grotesque blend of man and beast. Muscles rippled beneath its matted fur, and its elongated snout curled back to reveal rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. But it was its eyes that paralyzed me. Burning red, they radiated a hatred so pure, so animalistic, that I felt like prey in the truest sense of the word. It recoiled slightly from the light, growling and swiping the air with claws as long as butcher knives. My instincts kicked in, and I drew my gun, firing off a shot. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding me. The creature roared in fury, the bullet grazing its shoulder and sending it staggering back. I didn't wait to see if it was down for long. I turned and bolted toward the narrow passage, my boots slipping on the blood-slick floor. I barely made it through before I heard it coming after me, its massive claws scraping against the stone walls. The passage was just narrow enough to slow it down, but not by much. I scrambled forward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My flashlight flickered, and for one terrifying moment I was plunged into darkness. The sound of the creature's pursuit grew louder, closer, and I could feel the heat of its breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I burst out into the open air, gasping and stumbling as I tried to put as much distance between myself and the cave as possible. But it didn't stop. The creature exploded out of the cave behind me, its roar splitting the night. I turned and fired again, emptying the rest of the magazine into its chest. It staggered, blood pouring from its wounds, but it didn't fall. It was relentless, driven by some primal rage that seemed to defy logic. With no other option, I ran. The descent down the hill was even more treacherous than the climb up, the rain turning the dirt into a slippery mess. I nearly lost my footing multiple times, the weight of exhaustion threatening to drag me down, but fear kept me moving. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, its guttural snarls a constant reminder of how close it was. When I finally reached the bottom, I spotted my truck through the trees. It felt like a mirage, too good to be true, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as the creature burst into the clearing. Its bloodied frame was illuminated in the glow of the headlights, and for a brief moment we locked eyes. I'll never forget the look it gave me, pure, unbridled hatred. Then it lunged, slamming into the side of the truck with enough force to make the whole vehicle shudder. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life as I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, mud spraying from the tires as I tore down the narrow trail. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature chasing after me, its massive frame weaving between the trees with terrifying speed. But as the distance between us grew, its pace slowed, and eventually it disappeared into the shadows. When I finally pulled into the station, I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. They were trembling so badly that I had to sit in the truck for several minutes, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. My entire body ached and my clothes were soaked and torn, but none of that mattered. The image of that creature, its glowing red eyes and bloodied claws, was burned into my mind. I stumbled out of the truck and into the office, startling my supervisor, who looked at me like I had just crawled out of the grave. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. For a moment I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I tell him that the thing I'd spent years researching, the cryptid I had always believed was nothing more than folklore, was real? Instead, I muttered something about a bear attack and collapsed into a chair, my legs finally giving out beneath me. It wasn't until later, after I'd cleaned myself up and downed a strong cup of coffee, that I remembered the body in the back of my truck, the father's mangled remains. I didn't want to face it, but I knew I had to. With a heavy heart, I walked back out to the truck and gently pulled the tarp back. The sight of his lifeless form brought a lump to my throat, and I had to fight back tears. This man had been torn from his family, dragged into the darkness, and mutilated by a creature that should not exist. I called the sheriff's office and told them I'd found the body of a missing hiker. I didn't mention the creature, of course. They would never believe me. By the time the deputies arrived, I'd convinced myself that keeping quiet was the right thing to do. Let them think it was a bear attack, I thought. The last thing this community needs is a panic over some monster in the woods. But deep down, I knew the truth. The family was devastated when I broke the news. The boy's face crumpled with grief, and his mother clung to him, sobbing into his hair. I stood there awkwardly, feeling like an intruder on their pain. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "Did you see it?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind his words, a knowing look that sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, then nodded. "It's still out there, isn't it?" he said. I didn't have the heart to lie to him. "Yes," I said, "but I promise you I'm going to make sure it never hurts anyone again." In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those glowing red eyes, the rows of jagged teeth, the blood that matted its fur. I told myself that I needed to move on, to put it behind me and focus on my job. But I couldn't. The Smoky Mountains had always been a place of beauty and wonder for me, a sanctuary where I felt connected to something greater than myself. But now, that beauty was tainted by the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows. I started researching Dogman sightings in the area, combing through old newspaper articles, online forums, and first-hand accounts. The stories were eerily similar. Hunters finding shredded deer carcasses, hikers hearing guttural growls that made their blood run cold, campers waking up to find their tents slashed open. Most of these stories were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentified wildlife, but I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes. I began planning my return to Wolf Creek. This time I wouldn't be going in blind. I reached out to a few trusted friends, fellow rangers who shared my interest in cryptids, and told them about my encounter. They were skeptical at first, but when I showed them the boy's journal and described what I had seen, their skepticism turned to grim determination. We agreed to go back together, armed with enough firepower to take down whatever was out there. Part of me knew it was a dangerous gamble. The creature was intelligent, cunning, and clearly territorial. But I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. That family deserved closure, and the creature needed to be stopped before it could claim another victim. As I packed my gear and prepared for the journey ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Smoky Mountains were vast, their dark corners hiding secrets that no man was meant to uncover. The Dogman was just one of those secrets, a glimpse into a world that existed parallel to our own. just out of sight. And now that I'd seen it, I knew there was no going back. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. Not because I was brave, but because I had no other choice. The shadows in the Smokies were calling, and I was determined to find out what else was hiding within them.